Good morning. My name is Will Pomeranz, and I'm the director of the Kennan Institute. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Blair Ruble back to the Kennan Institute stage. In order to get the proceedings going, I will invite Ambassador Mark Green, the director and CEO of the Wilson Center, for some opening remarks.
Thank you. Thanks, Will. Thanks for those kind words. As many of you know, the Wilson Center was established by Congress some 5 decades ago for the purpose, in their words, of strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. And what that really means is that while other centers can deal with data and advocacy, we've been mandated to go further into scholarship and learning. And so our currency is knowledge, our focus is independent analysis, and our purpose is developing options and recommendations that decision makers, policymakers can count on. And we are fiercely nonpartisan. The Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, which will celebrate its 50th anniversary next spring, is a prime example of our mission. Since its inception, the Kennan Institute has supported scholarship on Ukraine and Eurasia that focuses not only on geopolitics and current events, but goes deeper into topics ranging from history and culture to society. It's with this mission in mind that the Kennan's Focus Ukraine blog launched its Arts of War series at the onset of Russia's brutal invasion last year. This series, which comes from our distinguished fellow and former Kennan Institute director, Dr. Blair Ruble, provides a weekly glimpse on Ukraine. It considers how artists and civil society use their work to grapple with the physical damage and the spiritual toll of a war that has raged on for more than 21 months. We are proud to launch an anthology of all of Dr. Ruble's contributions from the nearly past near 2 years, copies of which are available to all of you today. In addition, we are absolutely delighted to welcome the Ambassador Makarova back to the center today to help us commemorate Ukraine's culture and resilience during the war. In addition to Blair's writings, the commemoration includes today's debut at the Center of Culture versus War, a poster exhibit that will be hosted on our 4th floor from today through January. I am pleased to invite everyone in attendance today to view the exhibit and enjoy our reception following the event. For our online audiences, please come to visit the center to enjoy this exhibit over the next few months. Finally, we invite you to continue following the work of the Wilson Center and our new Ukraine in Europe initiative, which looks towards Ukraine's future in Euro-Atlantic structures and examines the many issues involved with that integration. I would also say, when we talk about the importance of art and culture in capturing what is going on in Ukraine, as I mentioned to the ambassador just briefly, I myself collect street art. It's one of my little foibles. And the most important piece and the first piece that I collected, that I purchased, was from Kyiv in 2014, capturing the strength, in my mind, and resilience of the Ukrainian people. Sadly, that Ukrainian resilience has been put to the test over and over again. But if I ever have doubt, I look at that painting and I look at the work that Blair has put forward, and it reminds me of the strength, the nobility, and the future of the Ukrainian people, which is indeed bright. Now I am delighted to turn the floor to Ambassador Makarova for a few additional comments, a few words of introduction. She arrived in D.C. as Ukraine's ambassador to the U.S. on April 20, 2021. She served in Ukraine's Ministry of Finance from 2018 to 2020, and she was a co-author of Ukraine's macroeconomic revival program, and among many other achievements, led an unprecedented fiscal consolidation in that country. Prior to her career in public service, she spent 17 years working in private equity and financial consulting. She is the right person in the right place at the right time, and we are delighted to welcome her here again. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Green, for your kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to be here, but I'm especially honored to be here together with my Vice Prime Minister, Irina Vereshchuk, at the Wilson Center when we are opening, when you are launching the Ukraine in Europe initiative, which is very important because it talks about why we are fighting today. It talks about what we are fighting for, and it actually explains what we are fighting against and why we are fighting. This initiative and decision to open Ukraine in Europe is extremely timely also. Because right now, when we are in 643rd day of this full-fledged war, but actually soon will be 10 years since Russia attacked us in the first place in 2014, I think it's very important to keep focus on what is the importance of this for us, Ukrainians, for Europeans, but also for Americans. Why this fight is not only about Ukraine. I'm also very glad, and I want to congratulate Dr. Ruble on the Arts of War collection, which again addresses the two critical issues: the Putin's genocidal effort to erase, or attempt to erase Ukraine's culture, but also the response our artists and our culture gives in order to preserve it. How Ukraine fights back on that front, which is a very important front as well. You all remember, because you all follow the situation in Ukraine very closely, the televised address of war criminal Vladimir Putin before he started this new phase of the war, where he actually said that Ukraine does not have a real statehood, that it's not a country at all, that actually it's the Russian cultural, historical, and spiritual place somehow. And in the last 20 months, we have seen all horrible war crimes that have been committed by the so-called liberators of the common, but as they said, common Russian space or Russian cultural space. During these 20 months, I just want to remind briefly that the occupiers have damaged 1,700 sites of cultural heritage, 1,700. They have destroyed or damaged 90 museums. They have looted so many of them. Just a rough estimate of the cultural damages is about 7 billion, and I'm sure it's just an estimate. When we will liberate all Ukraine and we will see the final damage, I'm sure that the damage is much greater, but then again, some damage on the cultural front, you cannot put a price tag to it. It's priceless for us Ukrainians, but also for civilizations. The shocking bombing of Mariupol Drama Theater, the destruction of Arkhip Kuinji Museum, the destruction of Maria Primachenko, the home of Grigory Skovoroda, who's a Ukrainian philosopher in Kharkiv Oblast, and complete destruction of that home that became museum. There are so many examples of this deliberate attack on the cultural sites. It's not a collateral damage. There was nothing military next to it. It was a very explicit attack on this. Now, in Odessa, just recently this summer, the 27 buildings that have been attacked in Odessa by direct bombing, all are UNESCO sites. This is not just our heritage. This is the heritage of the people of the world. I think, if you read this book, and Dr. Ruble is very convincingly demonstrating in this book, that the culture in Ukraine has shown profound resilience and resistance to it. That people are not only saving and guarding and preserving and delivering whatever they can save to a safer locations, but they actually create and do everything. The culture and art at war is flourishing, which is actually surprising, because you do not expect to see more art during the war. But this is what we see in Ukraine. And whether it's a philharmonic orchestras or opera houses or ballet dancers or folk, you see them in Ukraine, you see them performing on the front lines, you see them traveling throughout the world and here in the United States. This is their way of fighting. And I think it all comes down to, again, my first and something that I want to close my remarks with. The reason why it's important that you are opening this Ukrainian Europe program. The reason why we are fighting in this century, as we did in the previous century and a century before. November for us is the Holodomor Remembrance Day, when the Soviet Russia organized man-made hunger in Ukraine and millions perished. And yet even that physical genocide against people, against farmers, after first attack on priests, after then following attack on the, we would call them the opinion leaders right now, but, teachers and professors and historians in Ukraine, even that and years of Soviet occupation did not stop it. Because it all comes down to why. This is a civilizational choice for us, to be democratic, to be European. We are fighting for this choice in every century, every time we have a chance to become independent. And every time we make that historical civilizational choice, Russia attacks us. And this time, for the past 32 years, is the longest time, believe it or not, of our independence during the past 400 years. So, because it's a civilizational choice, we cannot lose this choice. Neither Ukraine, nor people who believe in democracy or believe in these values. People who believe that, European democratic values, transatlantic values, are the values of the world in which we all want to live. So the more we study it, the more we share the information, the more we inform public here in Europe and in Ukraine, the faster Ukraine will win, but also the faster we all will come back to a place of peaceful, normal life, which is a basis for the prosperity for so many of us, including this great country. So it's a great work. Again, Ambassador, thank you very much for this. Thank you and all your team for embarking on this initiative. And we at the Embassy look forward to working very closely with you on this one. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Ambassador Green and Ambassador Markarova and for their generous introductions and remarks, and I deeply appreciate their kind words. I also am deeply appreciative of the support that Will Pomerantz and the entire Kennan team has provided for my blog, The Arts of War. And this book is a collection of the first 50 posts which came out during the first year of the war. In particular, I want to acknowledge Victoria Pardini for her efforts to make it possible for all of us to be here today, both virtually and physically, and of course, the wonderful AV staff at the Wilson Center. Finally, I will mention and thank Mikhailo Minakov and Isabella Tabarovsky, whose stewardship of the Ukraine Focus blog has made my work possible. Now, before I say anything further, I want to make clear that this isn't really my book. I've simply reported on the inspiring work of Ukrainian artists in many fields, artists who immediately turned to their crafts to resist Russian physical and cultural violence. This is really their book. I'm simply the messenger. So with this in mind, permit me to say a few words about how all this came about. I'll then offer a couple of general observations emerging from the work, and we'll close with a brief video of a dance performance which captures the story more effectively than I ever could in words. I turned my attention away from Ukraine when I stepped down as director of the Kennan Institute a decade ago. However, if I walked away from Ukraine, Ukraine refused to walk away from me. About 4 years ago, I was caught off guard when a group of scholars in Kiev approached me concerning the publication of a Ukrainian translation of my book, The Muse of Urban Delirium. I hadn't expected there to be interest, but they moved forward and they produced a beautiful volume which came out in December 2021. We began to plan a book tour for Ukraine in the summer of 2022, and that's the process that lured me back to Ukraine, significantly through the lens of the arts. I wasn't surprised when Putin unleashed his unnecessary war. As the ambassador said, the signals were all there for anyone who wanted to see them. But I was shocked, and I began reaching out to the arts community in Ukraine, the very people I had been talking to about the book. And quite unexpectedly, I began hearing stories of how artists were using their talents to resist Russia, and of the Ukrainian government at all levels, from national down to the local level, of supporting those efforts. The Ukrainian government understood, as we just heard from Ambassador Markarova, that this was an important dimension to their own resistance. So I wrote a piece about Odessa for the Kennan Institute, and then I wrote a couple of more pieces, and we decided maybe I was onto something. And they offered me the opportunity to write about the arts once a week. In drawing up these essays, I purposefully sought to move around regions, art forms, and generations. And I've tried to bring in a little history, too, to provide context. The collection that we have here today is of the first 50 essays. And the blog has continued. You can find it online. So what insights have I gained about the war and about Ukraine through this approach? First, I think this story, the story of the arts, explains how a seemingly divided society coalesced so powerfully to defend a nation that was being contested. Today, Ukraine, like all states, is a product of history, economics, geography, demography, and culture. As is often the case with large countries, Ukraine at times is fragmented along these divisions. But as is also true of large countries, such divisions do not necessarily destroy the state. Over the past 30 years, young Ukrainians have grown up with no memory of the Soviet Union, secure in the notion that Russia is a different and unattractive country, fluent in the Ukrainian language no matter what they speak at home, and drawn to the economic well-being and values of Europe. There are also digital natives, which allowed me to access a lot of what was going on and allowed them to reach out to the world. They've created a vibrant new Ukrainian culture and identity. The effervescent Ukrainian pop music and hip-hop scenes, accompanied by sassy media and dynamic art, reflect a population that has chartered a fresh path following independence. And Ukrainian is the language of that culture. Whether cultivated by official or commercial outlets, we shouldn't forget that The Simpsons were broadcast in Ukrainian, or by homegrown social media, this new culture has remained, first and foremost, fun, which is important, and it's created a bond that transcends the divisions. The second large point is that the arts reshape the course of Ukrainian history and will reframe its future. The stories presented here highlight the ways in which Ukrainians have long explored the meaning of their country and culture through the arts. They show the manner in which the arts and their creators have empowered Ukrainians to confront Russian aggression. These developments often offer intriguing clues into what a future post-war Ukraine might look like. Simply put, the more Russian forces try to deny and destroy Ukrainian culture, the more it springs back to life. Adaptable Ukrainian artists in every genre have kept creating no matter what the Russians have thrown at them. Ukrainian artists and their audiences seek out basements and street corners, bomb shelters and public squares, concert halls, galleries, and websites to celebrate what it means to be Ukrainian, despite all of the privation that's being inflicted by the war. As the ambassador has noted, the Russian war machine has attacked Ukrainian cultural and educational institutions unrelentingly from the earliest days of its campaign to claim Ukraine as Russian. It's bombed and pillaged theaters, libraries, and museums. It's outlawed Ukrainian language conversation in areas it's occupied, and it's striven to convince the world that there's no such thing as Ukrainian culture. These efforts have only made the Ukrainian artistic community and the artists I write about more resilient. Like the children's game of whack-a-mole, every time the Russians bring the hammer down in one place, Ukrainians find ways to reassert themselves elsewhere, especially the artistic community. The third point, and this is a more general point, but it does bear on Ukraine as well. These stories reveal how art endures. It's politics that are fleeting. Renowned tango historian Robert Ferris Thompson once observed that culture is forever, it's ego that fades. The search for understanding of the human condition, for shared identity and values, and for creative expression evident in the stories I've written about, point to a contemporary Ukraine programmed to resist and to sustain itself in the face of Russian aggression. Ukrainians have created their own unique society and culture to be shared with other Ukrainians. That culture will endure. If only Putin had listened to some Ukrainian hip-hop instead of his corrupted advisors, he might have understood this better. I'd like to close with a 2-minute, 2.5-minute maybe, video that tells the story better than I can. As Ukraine's first Constitution Day of the war approached in June 2022, ballet dancer Olesya Vorotnyuk organized a brief performance entitled Ukrainian Ballet Says Stop to Russian Bullets. Choreographed by Valery Kovtun and set to the music of Konstantin Dankovich's ballet Lily, their piece was filmed for YouTube. And I think this performance speaks more powerfully than anything I've had to say today. So if the AV team can run the video, please. As an aside, Vorotnyuk, the lead ballerina, is from Donbass, and her husband was killed by Russians after 2014, and she herself has fought at the front. And she views her artistic work as an extension of that fight. So what I've seen, and I hope you will appreciate as well, is that the Ukrainian performing and visual artists, from painters to symphony musicians, from ballerinas to playwrights, from rock musicians to hip-hop artists, have taken up arms to defend their country. Simultaneously, they've turned their creative skills and imaginations to make powerful statements about Ukraine's culture, a culture that has and will survive. They never expected to be asked to fight a war, but having been asked, they've responded with arms and with art. I hope my modest book will cast light on their heroic stories. Thank you.
Well, it is a great pleasure to welcome Blair Ruble back to the Kennan Institute stage. And I want to congratulate Blair on his book. There are many things that I can say, but from the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Blair devoted significant resources to the study of the history and current events in Ukraine, in the process creating a community of scholars that continues to thrive today. Blair's extensive knowledge of Ukraine, from literature, ballet, puppetry, geography, and rap music, I didn't see that one coming, shines throughout this book. But I want to talk a little bit about the various themes in this book. And the first one is art and the power of resistance. How has the dialogue between artists and citizens shaped this battle between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think the first point to be made is that the artists are citizens, and it's the same community. And I think once the initial shock wore off, we see two simultaneous developments. One is the extension of bringing Ukrainian culture, taking it abroad. And we see that with symphony orchestras, with ballet companies. We see it with choral music. But the other was giving definition to resistance. And one of the stories I write about in the book is the war was only 2 weeks or so old, and it was unclear what was going to happen. If we remember, there was the thought that Russia was going to overrun Kiev and set up its own government. And there's a street artist in Kiev, I tell the story in the book, who he initially was from eastern Ukraine, and he wanted to go out, despite martial law and curfews, and paint on the streets. And he did so with the support of his military commander. And what he painted was a tattered Ukrainian flag that was being sewn together by hands of a soldier. A very poignant message in a normal urban Ukrainian community. And I think that was the other way that the arts, and over time it builds up, but this was immediate. It was a way of saying, we're here and we're in this together. So I think there are two ways in which the arts have played, and many people here saw the ballet before. There have been various musical groups, but I think this internal story is as important, or maybe even more important. So
the other themes in this book, which is really quite comprehensive, in terms of the arts and how the arts has shaped Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian current events. To what extent has art made Ukraine a global player? It kind of increased its global recognition. You've talked about various types of music and puppetry and so forth, but to what extent has art basically made Ukraine part of a global community?
Well, you really see this in theater, and it's a very interesting story. I'm not sure any of this would have happened were it not for the war, but you may have noticed that Woolly Mammoth opened its season with a contemporary Ukrainian play. That was not accidental. Within days of the Russian invasion, the Center for International Theater Development and the Sputnik Theater in London joined together, raised funds, and started a call for new scripts about the war. And they paid Ukrainian playwrights, I think it was $500 initially, and they organized play readings around the world in over 80 countries, in over 24 languages. And those efforts have resonated. Most interestingly, a theater in Hong Kong has had a Ukrainian Theater Festival because they found that these new Ukrainian works actually spoke to the challenges being faced by their Hong Kong audience members. There almost every day that there's a theater performance in London, there's at least one Ukrainian work either being read or being shown. I don't think any of that would have happened were it not for the war. But the war created the mechanism that allowed a theater company that already was standing up on its own to suddenly capture the attention internationally.
So you also talk about the role of Ukraine as a part of European culture and European history. Can you talk about how the war has reconnected Ukraine to European values and European history?
Well, I think as the ambassador very clearly stated, part of what the war is about is moving Ukraine forcefully into a European context. And what's interesting is, in some ways, Ukraine was already there. You wouldn't necessarily have noticed it if you paid attention to politics. But this is why I've come back a couple of times to hip-hop and to rock music. Ukraine has a very vibrant popular music scene. The bands of many different kinds toured regularly to Europe. Many Ukrainian bands were already part of the Berlin pop music scene, which maybe is the most dynamic in the world. And if you had paid attention to this, you would have realized that there was a transformation taking place within Ukraine that was generational. And that the young people who created and listened to that music were already very different from previous generations. And that difference had to do with the integration of their popular music into Europe. You know, I remember, we talk about the Kennan Institute stage, right after the Orange Revolution, Ambassador Bill Miller came back. Mm-hmm. And he had been there and he was reporting on it. And what did Bill want to talk about most? The role of hip hop in the Orange Revolution. There was something, he was right, there was something transformational taking place. And if you didn't pay attention to popular culture, you wouldn't have noticed it. And so there are lots of ways in which we all misunderstood what was happening in Ukraine because we weren't used to looking at, you know, what kids are doing out the back door.
So one of the things that you mention and illuminate in this book is how diversity is a positive value and how the arts has led to a more diverse Ukraine. So talk about just how diversity has shaped Ukraine in a result of this war and also going forward.
Well, I think in order to look forward, we need to look back. And we need to remember that Ukraine was not only entered through Moscow. Large portions of the country were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were part of Poland. Some were forced to be part of Hungary during the war. There was a large Jewish population in many regions of Ukraine. These communities in the past created their own cultural forms. World War II and the horrendous killing fields of that part of the world severed those ties for a while. But if we take any Ukrainian art form and peel it back, it wasn't only the influence of Moscow that was having an important effect. I mean, if you take a look at Ukrainian theater, the foundational moment is Kurbas arriving from Vienna and setting up a revolutionary theater in the 20s and 30s. Now, he was one of, I think it's 134, but one of several dozen Ukrainian intellectuals who were shot on the same day at the end of the 1930s, thus severing what could have been a creative link. But what he accomplished lived on in the minds of the people he trained, people who went to his plays. So those legacies in several of the communities in eastern Ukraine, and I write about this, Jewish culture exists, and even though the Jewish communities sadly were obliterated. And these all gave contemporary Ukrainian artists who wanted an alternative telling of their story, something to grab onto other than just Moscow dominated it all. And you see it in theater, and you see it in classical music in particular.
So you talk about how Ukrainian culture, and you've mentioned this now already, kind of reveals the path forward for Ukraine. So, and you talked about its independence and its long history of culture. So how does culture reveal what the future of Ukraine as a European nation, as a global cultural center? How does culture and reveal what is the possibilities of Ukraine going forward?
Well, I think, it's always very difficult to talk about what's happening in culture and understanding its relationship to what's happening in society. Clearly, there's a link, but it's a complicated one, and it's not direct. But I would say, looking at the artists I've written about, and I said a little bit of this in the talk, they embrace a Ukraine that is free, that has a place for the kinds of edgy culture that they've created. They embrace a Ukraine that looks to Europe. Many of the practitioners I write about have European ties and connections. It is talking about a Ukraine in which Ukrainian language is the basis, and it is a very interesting evolution, again, going back to hip-hop, of Eastern Ukrainian hip-hop changing languages from Russian to Ukrainian about 2010, because it was felt the Ukrainian language better expressed what they wanted to express. So what we see is they're digital natives, largely urban. It's a different kind of Ukraine, and there are building blocks there to build a new Ukraine. I will also say that traditional Ukrainian folk art is being rediscovered, but often reinterpreted in modern ways as well. So there are ways in which you can see hints of a future Ukraine that would be European, emerging from the arts. Whether or not, again, you can't draw a straight line from that process and what will happen, but it gives some notions of where to look for a different Ukraine, perhaps.
We're going to open the floor for questions, both in the auditorium and online. We welcome the audience can submit their questions via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter, or at Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page at any time. Please remember to include your name and affiliation sending your questions. So we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. Right here. Yes.
Hi. You spoke a lot about the performance arts, theater, ballet, and pop music, but could you speak a little more? You mentioned a little bit more about creative arts, painting and urban art. Could you speak a little more about that? Do you deal with that? Do you know anything more about that?
Yeah,
Modern artists, contemporary artists, stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I deal with it somewhat in this book, and I deal with it in some subsequent blog posts. I think that the Arsenal in Kiev had a exhibit back about a year ago, which in and of itself is amazing when you think about what was going on, and it brought together art, pictorial art, sculpture, that was actually generated by the war. And there are very powerful themes of loss. There are artists that are working. There's another trend which is small, but I think maybe significant, of artists turning to make artwork out of the wreckage of the Russian war machine. There's maybe a dozen artists who have moved in that direction, which, and some of the work is quite powerful. And the other part is the rediscovery, perhaps by a generation of Ukrainians who never really looked back to their folk traditions, of powerful folk art artists. There's a post we just did last week on Yulia Dunayeva, who's from eastern Ukraine, and she's a ceramicist, and she is trying to recapture the vitality of the traditions she works with. So it's all part of a picture. I think in some ways the performance arts are more accessible. I mean, much of this work is done because of the internet, frankly. And it's a little bit more difficult to get a handle on painting and sculpture, but it is a vibrant scene as well.
Right in front here? We're gonna get you a microphone.
Ellen Windsor, Wilson Council. When I was trying to get to understand President of the Ukraine, I stumbled across YouTube. He was singing with his guitar, contemporary American music. His wife was with him, very capable artist as well, their voices. And there was also a love story, obviously, going on between them and the tenderness of their words. So I'm wondering how much, as a leader, this aspect of him is compelling and relevant.
It's absolutely fundamental. I mean, it helps that you have an actor-comedian as a president, one who, I think part of the story that is interesting, and I alluded to it in passing, isn't just that the artists themselves are responding, but that they're finding support from the Ukrainian government. And not too long ago, we had Hobart Earl, the music director of the Odessa Symphony here, and he had a picture with the president, and the president promising, we'll see what happens, to fix the roof on his concert hall. But it's part of who Zelensky is. And that makes a huge difference in that he, as you noted, he and his wife naturally value the expression of the arts. It's I'm talking about bottom up, but there has to be a top down that meets it. And this is an important aspect of it for sure.
We have a question from Martha Merritt, former Kennan scholar. Blair mentioned the increased use of Ukrainian language. What signs are there that Ukrainian is becoming a more dominant language through the country, including its eastern regions?
Well, I will speak about the people I'm writing about. I will not speak generally, except I think that the process is probably the same. 2014 is a turning point. And there were many I mean, part of the mystery and part of Putin's miscalculation is, why didn't Eastern Ukrainians just rise up and greet the Russian army? And part of it is because a lot of people in Eastern Ukrainian who grew up in Russian language environments didn't want to be part of Putin's Russia. As one Ukrainian poet I write about says, I'm going to continue writing in Russian because I don't want Putin to take my language. But the fact of the matter is, after 2014, several prominent Ukrainian writers began to write in Ukrainian rather than Russian. These are writers who had had success in Russia. The theater community and the movie community, Ukrainian artists start moving back, and when they move back, in some cases they're native speakers of Russian. It's hard for them to switch, but it became a choice to try to speak in Ukrainian. I talk about the Ukrainian hip hop artists, and I don't want to just generalize from 100, 200 artists to a whole society, but I think that this is reflective of a decision. And I go back to something that people always overlook. You can grow up in a Russian household, but if you go to school, you're going to learn Ukrainian. So Ukrainian becomes the language that you use in communicating with others. And I think, we're 30 years out from the collapse of the Soviet Union, more. This process, when you look at younger generations, has really moved along. And at this point, there clearly is a sorting out. Those who want to remain in Ukraine are going to be speaking Ukrainian. There's been movement of peoples as well. So I won't hazard a guess on sort of general percentages, but I think these trends all point to a strengthening of Ukrainian language.
Wait.
Thank you. Wayne Mary, American Foreign Policy Council. Thank you, Blair. I've been reading every week. I've been reading your thing. You're among the most interesting thing that's on the Wilson Kennan blog. On the use of language, I absolutely agree with you about the growth of Ukrainian. My last few visits to Ukraine, I find I can't use Russian. They don't want me to. It means we then have to find a language. Often it's English, sometimes it's German. But in terms of communicating with Europe, I personally don't think Europe is going to start learning Ukrainian. To the extent they're going to have an Eastern Slavic language, it's going to be Russian. And Russian and Ukrainian are not the same language at all. So my question is, what are the Ukrainians going to be using in their communication with the outside world? Is it going to be English, or is it going to be a mixture of European languages? Because Europe is not just English speaking, it's also German and French and Italian speaking. In terms of communication, this is a lot of linguistics for people in Ukraine, younger people, to master. Are they just going to forget Russian? Are they just going to learn English? How are they going to adapt in a world in which they are part of Europe and the world to an extent that their parents, grandparents never were, but their parents and grandparents, to the extent they did it in Russian. And that's now, for most of them, not an option of choice. So what are they going to be, do you think are going to be their linguistic directions?
I don't know, have you tried to speak Russian in Poland or Lithuania or Estonia lately? They're part of the EU. I think, my supposition, this is really based on nothing more than a supposition, is that as in Poland, Ukrainians will learn English. And Ukrainians who have a particular connection to Germany or France may learn German and French. But I think, like the rest of Eastern Europe following the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's not going to be Russian that connects them to the outside world.
Any more questions right here?
Thank you so much. My name's Arno Kurtz. I'm a global fellow here at the Wilson Center. And first of all, I want to thank you, Ruble, for Blair, for this lovely presentation, and then, of course, both ambassadors for the introductory remarks, and Director Pomerantz. I really like how you've been pushing the cultural factors, and especially arts, given your side hobbies and music and culture. And this is not new when we think about the Cold War, ping-pong diplomacy, so politics. And so my question is a bit of a logistical, organizational one, getting back to Ambassador Green's remarks at the very beginning of the Wilson Center being sort of this hub between policy and scholarship. So my question is, and that is a shout out to Lauren Reese's work on the Environment and Security Program here. You've been the director of the Kennan Center, but you've been now sort of introducing these memory politics and these cultural aspects. Are there any thoughts of combining these things? I work under the leadership of Christian Osterman at the History and Public Policy Program, of really consolidating this and making this an acute issue within the center, and thinking about restructuring or pushing this into not necessarily a different program, but so that is to all of you, not only to you, Blair. Thank you.
I can say is one of the good aspects of being a distinguished scholar, which is basically our emeritus status, is that I don't have to worry about administration and fundraising anymore. But I think clearly this has been, I've been around the Wilson Center a long time, and going back to Jim Billington, there has always been a sense of the need to cast the net wider than just the contemporary political moment. And that has given the space in the Wilson Center for a number of people over the years to bring in culture and other kinds of soft subjects. And I think we see this in the Middle East program, we see it in the Latin America program, and Warren Reese's environment program. I don't know if there's going to be any effort to kind of solidify these trends, but I will note that Ambassador Green did point out he collects street art, so there may be an opening. I don't know, Will, you're actually in the fray, as it were.
Yes, well, we continue to focus on Ukraine, and indeed that's one of the most vibrant parts of the post-Soviet space, and we want to make sure that we cover, all the various initiatives, including the arts, that are taking place in the post-Soviet space. So this is a very important part of our direction, and you have set us on a very important course, Blair, and we are always grateful for having you come back to the Kennan Institute and sharing your experiences. So I just want to thank Blair, as well as Ambassador Makarova and our distinguished guests from the Ukrainian Embassy. We're going to wrap up our discussion, and our final speaker will be Irina Vereshchuk, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine and Minister for Reintegration of the Temporarily Occupied Territories.
I will speak in Ukrainian. Excuse me.
That's fine.
Thank you very much.
And do you want to? Okay, you're okay.
Так, шановна пані посол, шановний пане Блере, шановні колеги, я тут, щоб засвідчити вам нашу глибоку повагу та шану.
Your Excellency, Ambassador William Blair, thank you very much, and distinguished audience, thank you very much for having me here. I'm here to thank you and to honor you.
Я від імені українського уряду хочу подякувати, щиро подякувати вам усім за ту величезну підтримку, за людяність, за щирість у тому, що ви зробили на початку війни і робите для нас зараз.
On behalf of the Ukrainian government, I would like to thank all of you for supporting Ukraine, for the amazing acts of humanity that you've demonstrated to the Ukrainian people, for your support, for your empathy, and for your understanding of what Ukraine is dealing with right now.
Наша країна далеко від Сполучених Штатів географічно, але ми дуже близькі, бо ми люди, ми цивілізація, ми демократія і ми культура.
Our countries are located very far from each other, and yet we are very close because we share the same values of humanity, of democracy and culture.
Мистецтво,
And
культура та музика – це про цивілізацію та гуманізм.
Music, culture, and art, all this is about civilization. All this is about common cultural values.
А в умовах війни – це про стійкість, про величезну стійкість, яка формується саме завдяки митцям, саме завдяки музиці, культурі і мистецтву.
And during the war, it is also resilience that is being built by Ukrainians through art, through culture, through wanting to express their identity in spite of the horrible war going on.
Пане Блере, ваша праця, ваша книга – це форма спротиву варварству і насильству, яке демонструє Росія сьогодні в Україні і всьому світі.
And Mr. Ruble, your amazing book is about resistance, is about how Ukraine resists and fights back with barbarism and violence of the 21st century.
Нам дуже важливо, щоб ви і такі, як ви, доносили правду через те, що ви бачите, через те, що ви можете опрацювати і осягнути. Правду світові про те, що та хто є Україна для світу. Рівно, як і правду, яким злом є Росія для всього цивілізованого світу.
And thank you for sharing the truth about Ukraine with the world, about what Ukraine is and what Russia is with all its violence and with all its attempts to destroy Ukraine and its identity.
В українському уряді я опікуюся тимчасово окупованими територіями. Це більше 5 мільйонів людей, які терплять надзвичайно великі знущання, насильство і тероризм з боку Росії.
In the Ukrainian government, my portfolio is working with occupied territories of Ukraine, temporarily occupied territories. And as of now, Ukraine has 5 million of internally displaced community and also people who are still living under Russian occupation, suffering unspeakable acts of violence, unspeakable acts of violation of human rights.
Перше, що робили росіяни, коли заходили на нашу територію, на наші землі, вони спалювали книги в бібліотеках. Вони знищували пам'ятки архітектури. Вони стріляли зі зброї по наших пам'ятниках.
And the first things that Russian would do during this war, when they would come into Ukrainian city, they would burn the books, Ukrainian books in the libraries. They would destroy architectural monuments. They would shoot at monuments, sites and other places that are important and sacred for Ukrainians.
З музеїв викрадалися усі цінні пам'ятки, які є надбанням не тільки України, а й цілого світу. Викрадались і вивозились у Росію.
And you also know that Russians looted Ukrainian museums, artwork that is not just Ukrainian heritage, but that is of global importance, global cultural importance. They looted and stole and took back to Russia hundreds and thousands of pieces of artwork.
На тимчасово окупованій території не діють церкви, окрім російської московського патріархату. Усі церковні надбання передані до Росії. Усі приміщення передані і експропрійовані у Росію. І Баптистська церква, до прикладу, є під повною забороною на тимчасово окупованій території.
And to give you an example on what happens to the issues of religion, all churches on the occupied territories, temporarily occupied territories, are closed, except for the Russian church. Every single church, the premises of it, and whatever the church owns has been transferred into the property of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Baptist Church, for your knowledge, has been officially prohibited on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine.
Я спілкуюся з людьми, які сьогодні проживають на тимчасово окупованій території, саме тих, які відносять себе до Баптистської церкви, до церкви п'ятидесятників. І, повірте, їм заборонено збиратись, їм заборонено говорити про свою релігію і про те, як вони моляться до Бога. Їм все заборонено. І на сьогодні це величезна трагедія для таких людей, бо вони не можуть виїхати з цієї території, бо гуманітарних коридорів теж немає. Росія їх взяла і використовує як живий щит у своїй боротьбі проти української армії.
And when we find ways to talk to people, to Ukrainians who live on the temporarily occupied territories, they tell me these horrible stories about how Baptist Church and other Protestant churches have been actually closed, how people are prohibited from gathering, from praying together, how hard it is for them to express their religious beliefs. And again, these people, for different reasons, still on the occupied territories, they could not escape because Russia does not open humanitarian corridors and does not allow these people to go because it wants to keep Ukrainians there as human shields.
Тому моє велике прохання, щоб ми не зупинялись. Ми, українці, свій вибір зробили. Ми будемо битись, боротись до кінця за наші території, за наших людей. І я дуже прошу, звертаючись до вас, так само продовжувати боротись за цивілізацію, за цінності, за все те, що робить нас людьми, в першу чергу людьми.
And I would like to encourage and ask all of you to keep supporting us and to support us in our fight because we Ukrainians have made our choice. We have decided and we have chosen to resist, to fight back, to get our territory back, to get our country back and to continue to be Ukrainians, to continue to keep our identity. And when you support us in this fight, you're also fighting not just for the Ukrainian culture, but for the culture in general, for the same principles and values and beauty of culture that is the heritage of all humanity.
І на завершення, я знаю, що логічним продовженням цього заходу є відкриття спеціальної виставки «Culture Fights Back», створеної Українським інститутом та Міністерством закордонних справ України.
And I know that after this event, we will continue into looking at the exhibition that is called Culture Fights Back that was organized by the Ukrainian Institute and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Власне, ця виставка розповідає про наших митців та мисткинь. Вона розповідає про громадянське суспільство, про наших акторів, актрис, співаків, які одягнули форму і встали на захист держави.
And this exhibition talks about how Ukraine continues to be a country of culture, how many artists and performers and actors and other creative industry representatives actually fought with the ways that they can. But many of them are fighting on the front line as soldiers. Many of them actually physically fight for Ukraine in the trenches, for the Ukrainian independence and for the Ukrainian culture.
Серед героїв цієї фотовиставки багато, власне, героїв книги пана доктора Рубла, яку він присвятив, яку ми сьогодні обговорюємо.
And when you look at this exhibition, you will see many people whom Dr. Ruble described in his book. So you will actually see the photos and the images of the people that you will later read about in the book.
Я усіх запрошую подивитися на цю виставку, а також подивитись в очі нашим героям. У них ви побачите стійкість, бажання жити, бажання перемагати і бажання бути людьми.
And I would like all of you to encourage to look at this exhibition, to look into the eyes of the Ukrainian heroes, of the Ukrainian artists. In their eyes, you will see this commitment, this dedication to fighting, to continuing fighting, to continue to be humans, to continue to enjoy living in Ukraine and to continue to enjoy its art and beauty.
На жаль, деякі з них уже загинули.
Unfortunately, many of those artists that you will see at this exhibition are no longer with us. Some of them got killed on the front line.
І наше з вами завдання – зробити все, щоб їхній подвиг не був намарним.
And our job is to keep the memory of them, is to make sure that their deeds are not forgotten.
Ще раз вам дякую. Ще раз дякую вам усім за підтримку, за допомогу. І наша перемога буде нашою спільною з вами перемогою. Я не сумніваюся у цьому.
Thank you again for coming. And once again, once Ukraine wins, it will be our common victory. I have no doubts about it.
Дякую. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And as advertised, there's going to be a reception and an art exhibit on the 4th floor. So I will encourage everyone to go down to the 4th floor and to have talk to Blair and everybody at the reception. And I just want to thank Blair and everybody else, especially Katja Smogli, who has helped organize the panel and personally brought me to Lviv and my family roots as well. So thank you very much, and we'll continue downstairs. Thank you.